Good evening from New York. It has been thus on every sinking ship from Titanic to the SS Minnow of Gilligan's Island. A few far-thinking visionaries try to get off first and get others to leave with them. Then others begin to file off one by one, and after them, the deluge. And so it is for the Bush administration's policy in Iraq. Our fifth story on the countdown, conservative Republican Senator Pete Domenici yesterday, conservative Republican Congressman John Doolittle today. Hope you can swim, boys. This while the top national security officer from the Reagan administration insisting that the only way to protect the troops in Iraq is to get the Bush administration to bring them home, and the only way to do that may be to threaten the president directly with impeachment. The commander-in-chief having now supported the troops to a death toll of 3,592 with no end in sight. Conservative Congressman Doolittle of California, one-time Mormon missionary, today joining the others in his party in questioning whether the conflict is worth the loss of any more American lives. His remarks, though, making the congressman sound less like a great humanitarian or a patriot and rather more like a huge xenophobe. I am increasingly convinced, said Mr. Doolittle, that we are never going to succeed in actually ending people dying in Iraq. I think it's going to be a constant conflict, and if that is going to happen, it needs to be the Iraqis dying and not the Americans. The White House saying today it views any sort of precipitous withdrawal from Iraq as dangerous. The Pentagon, that leaving early would leave that country a mess. But Lieutenant General William Odom, the Director of National Security for President Reagan, the Bush administration says that he says that the Bush administration, rather, should no longer be allowed to determine the vocabulary for the debate. General Odom's contention that supporting the troops actually means bringing them home. And now, Mr. Odom pointing out that Congress clearly and indisputably has two powers over the executive, the power of the purse and power to impeach. Should the first option fail, Mr. Odom saying lawmakers should not be afraid to threaten the second, having ample justification to do so. An attempt to extort Congress into providing funds by keeping U.S. forces in peril surely would constitute the high crime of squandering the lives of soldiers and Marines for his, the president's, own personal interest. An honor for us once again to be joined by our analyst, retired four-star Army General Wesley Clark, also, of course, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and a former Democratic presidential candidate. General Clark, thanks for being with us again tonight.
Good to be with you, Keith.
That plan that has been put forth by General Odom, would the main obstacle to that plan seem to be lawmakers in Congress having the guts to execute it?
Well, I think the country's not quite there yet on the impeachment issue, but I do think that it's important to get those troops out of Iraq. It's time for the United States to begin redeploying. We've given it 4 long years. The politics has never come together. This administration won't do the diplomacy in the region, and it's left our men and women in uniform out there exposed. Bill Odom's a strategist. He's thinking it strategically, and he says you're in a situation where you're only losing more with each passing day.
The general's comments regarding the rhetoric of this, control the rhetoric, you control the debate. How is it, in your estimation, that the administration continues to have a stranglehold on this phrase, supporting the troops, when 3,592 of them have died and scores of thousands more have been wounded physically or psychologically?
Keith, it's hard for me to explain it. I mean, we've had Democrats for the last 3 years talking about how this administration hasn't supported the troops, hasn't provided them the body armor, hasn't given them a winning strategy, hasn't taken care of the veterans when they've come home. This administration doesn't support the troops in Iraq. It supports its political aims, which was to go in there and knock off one state after another through regime change. It's holding on in Iraq, waiting for the term to end, and then dump the problem on the Democrats at the expense of our troops and the United States of America.
When it comes to things like equipment, body armor, size of the troop force, is there a way of measuring how the administration has supported its troops in the field, not rhetorically but practically?
Well, I think you can look at the actual issues that have been brought up, and you can look at the amount of the buy that's been made. Secretary Rumsfeld said it best. He said we went to war with the army that we had, but that was in response to a soldier's complaint. And the soldiers know they didn't have the body armor they needed. We still don't have the right protective vehicles there to deal with the improvised explosive devices. And we don't have, and we've never had, enough troops on the ground to really do the kind of peacekeeping mission that was required. But even worse than that is the strategic failure, Keith. You know, soldiers expect their leaders to do the hard work of diplomacy and to use the military only as a last resort. Because when you use the military, it's final. People die. The fate of nations hangs on it. It's much better for the diplomats to work it all out first if they can. Well, this administration didn't give the diplomacy a real chance to work before the war, and now in dealing with Iran and Syria, it's simply refusing to do the diplomacy that's required. Our men and women, most of all, need the support of good leadership, courageous leadership in the White House, and they don't have it.
Do the motives of other leaders, or perhaps the courage even of other leaders, do the actual origins matter? Congressman Doolittle, who was mentioned today, linked to 2 bribery scandals. Senator Domenici was involved. Just yesterday called for change of course in Iraq. Was involved in this. It really sort of kicked off the U.S. Attorney's firing scandal, and he's up for re-election next year. Do the motives of Republicans who are defecting detract at all from the size of the problem that potentially looms for the president?
Well, if you're suggesting that their motives are that they're not great strategic thinkers, but they might be interested in re-election, I think that's an appropriate concern for anyone in political office. I mean, they are supposed to reflect the views of their constituents. It's clear that they're hearing from the constituents that they don't want any more of the policy. So regardless of what their strategic acumen is, I think it's a good thing for the country that the Republican Party is starting to come apart here at the edges and maybe deeper as the president pursues this policy in Iraq, because it's only the politics of it that can change the strategy of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a big table, but there's seats for everybody. General Wesley Clark, MSNBC analyst, again, our pleasure, sir. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Keith.